Welcome to the debate. Today we are tackling a central tension straight from Module 9 of the LPR Academy material. And it's a big one. It's about what happens when a client comes to an LPR advisor completely desperate for immediate resume fixes.
Right, the classic panic requests.
Exactly. They say things like, make my resume stronger or add more keywords. And the core question is, must the advisor rigidly adhere to the foundational doctrine of orientation before optimization?
Which is easier said than done.
Well, think of it like a structural engineer walking into a building with a cracked foundation, right? If the owner asks them to just slap a fresh coat of paint over the drywall so they can sell the place quickly...
There is a professional obligation to refuse. Yeah, I know the analogy.
Right. You do not optimize the surface when the source is compromised. You have to diagnose the foundation first. So I'll be representing the strict methodological view today. The advisor must, always diagnose the source layer before optimizing the surface. Because without that orientation, the advisor risks polishing the wrong thing and effectively engaging in malpractice.
And I come at it from a different way. I'm representing a more pragmatic counter perspective here. I'm arguing that the rigid sequential doctrine of, diagnose before optimizing can and frankly should collapse under the realities of client urgency.
Collapse? That's a strong word.
But it's true. If that building is actively on fire and the owner is trapped inside and just needs to get out, lecturing them about the integrity of the concrete footing before you hand them an extinguisher, that isn't principled engineering. It's academic detachment. In cases of extreme desperation, targeted optimization is actually the most effective form of orientation.
Okay. To understand why that extinguisher analogy falls totally short in our practice, we have to look at the core doctrine in clip 5 of the material.
Mm-hmm.
The very first thing an advisor must internalize is that they are not just a resume technician. When a client walks in, their requests are almost always optimization requests.
Absolutely.
They say, make my resume stronger. They say, add more keywords. Make me sound senior. Or, even tell me what career to pursue. The strict rule is that the advisor must orient before optimizing. You have to stop and ask the diagnostic questions.
Which are extensive.
But necessary. Is this a surface problem or a source problem? Is evidence missing? Is the context missing? Is the claim completely unsupported by the actual record? Is privacy limiting the surface? Is AI inflating the language? Is the target lane even credible?
Those are all perfectly valid questions in a vacuum, but
if you skip them, you aren't doing LPR work. You are just a typist polishing an unsupported claim. Without orientation, the advisor may polish the wrong thing entirely.
right, but
You risk exposing sensitive data or worse, creating a surface that just crumbles the moment an employer actually stress tests it. That is why orientation must precede optimization, always.
look, I hear the doctrine, and I absolutely acknowledge that the client owns the source layer. I am not suggesting we invent claims out of thin air here.
Okay, good.
But I'm pushing back on the absolute unyielding rigidity of this method in practice. We have to look at the actual human being sitting across the desk. They are arriving with exhaustion, financial pressure, fear, and what the text brilliantly calls silence fatigue.
Well, silence fatigue is very real, yes.
It's soul-crushing. Think about the psychological mechanism behind it. The modern applicant tracking system, the ATS, it's a black hole. A client sends out 200 applications into this low feedback system and hears absolutely nothing back.
Right.
That system systematically strips away their human agency. The resume surface becomes literally the only thing they feel they can control. So insisting on a deep philosophical source layer orientation in that exact moment, when they just need a win to feel alive in the process, can be incredibly tone-deaf.
Tone deaf?
Yeah. My position is grounded in the text's own admission that, quote, urgency may affect how small the first scope is. When an advisor radically shrinks the scope to meet an urgent need, say fixing just one bullet point so a client can submit a job application before a midnight deadline, they are functionally optimizing a surface first to provide immediate relief. We have to meet the client where they are, not where the method wishes they were.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on what it actually means to help someone in that broken system.
Sure.
When a client asks, "Can you just make me sound better?" they are asking us to play a game that they are already losing. You mentioned the low feedback overloaded hiring systems demanding specific formatting and keywords, right?
Yeah, the ATS filter.
Right. Refusing to blindly optimize is not costing them an opportunity. It's saving them from a liability. If we just optimize without orienting, we are essentially prescribing a painkiller without taking an X-ray.
Oh, come on. You're talking about x-rays and defensibility, but that clinical approach ignores why they are begging for the painkiller in the first place. This brings us straight into the psychological reality of the job search.
It does, but let's stick with the mechanics of the X-ray for a second, because it matters.
Okay, fine.
Think about how this actually plays out. A client comes in with a messy transition, and they want the resume to look pristine. If you just give them the painkiller, if you just use AI to inflate their job description to perfectly match a posting, you temporarily relieve the pain.
Right, the resume looks nice.
Exactly. The resume looks nice, but you are completely ignoring the underlying fracture
How so?
because you haven't checked for claim maturity or privacy labeling.
Let's unpack that.
Say the client wants to add a bullet saying they drove $5 million in enterprise revenue. The painkiller approach just adds the keyword and the number to get past the filter.
To get them in the door, yes.
But orientation asks the mechanical questions. Is this claim mature? Did this project actually ship, or are we claiming a result that hasn't fully materialized? And on privacy. Does adding this specific revenue metric expose proprietary company data from your last employer?
Well, obviously we check for that.
But you can't if you just optimize first. You have to ask, how do we obfuscate the exact number while keeping the claim defensible? If you skip that and just make the claim louder, you might expose them to a background check failure or a lawsuit. Stronger isn't louder. Stronger is more defensible.
Look, I'm not arguing for exposing proprietary data, but I know what the audience is thinking listening to this.
What's that?
How on earth do you do a full evidence inventory, check claim maturity, and apply privacy constraints when the client is staring at a job application that closes in a few hours?
You scale it.
But the client is facing a machine that filters them out if the exact keyword isn't there. If you don't give them the painkiller, if you don't optimize for that keyword right then and there, they don't even get into the building to have their structural integrity tested.
That's a false dichotomy, though.
The text says we shouldn't drift from evidence into hype, and I agree with that. But adding a keyword that a client physically possesses the experience for just to get past a filter isn't hype. It's survival.
But how do you know they physically possess the experience if you haven't oriented?
Because you ask them as you are writing it. When you force a desperate client through a rigid multi-step diagnostic sequence just to add the word agile to their resume, you are letting the method get in the way of the result.
I'm really not convinced by that line of reasoning, because I think you are conflating a transactional resume writing service with CLPRA certification.
I'm not conflating them. I'm being realistic.
The text explicitly says that the advisor is not a resume technician. If the client just wants someone to hack an ATS, they can go hire a resume writer. But if they are coming to a certified living professional record advisor, our restraint is part of the service.
Even when they're panicking?
Especially when they're panicking. If we just add agile without stopping to ask, what evidence actually supports this claim of agile methodology? Was it formal certification? A single sprint? We are drifting from source into surface. We lose the accountability to the record.
But this naturally leads to the question of why clients demand painkillers to begin with. It's the emotional reality. Think about the specific client scenario from Module 9.
The transition shock scenario.
Exactly. The client sits down and says, the whole system is broken, nothing matters. That is transition shock. When a client is in that state, telling them to examine their, channel claim and rendering, it feels clinical and detached.
I disagree.
They're drowning, and the advisor is asking them to evaluate the chemical composition of the water. They need immediate, actionable optimization just to feel a sense of agency again.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it very differently. Why do they feel like they are drowning?
Because the system is broken.
Because, as we discussed with silence fatigue, the system has no face. The client starts internalizing the silence. They think their lack of success is a verdict on their human worth. If we just jump in and optimize the surface to give them a quick hit of dopamine like, look at this shiny new resume, we are actually validating their false premise.
We're giving them hope.
No,
We are reinforcing the idea that their human worth is tied to that piece of paper.
Nobody is saying their worth is tied to the paper.
But functionally, that's what the dopamine hit does. The LPR doctrine explicitly states, dignity before the record. Human dignity does not depend on evidence, and it certainly does not depend on employability.
Right.
By separating what the client can govern, their historical evidence, their context, their claims, from what they cannot govern, which is an overloaded, broken labor market, the advisor provides steadiness. We provide orientation to ground the client in their own truth. We give them control over the source layer precisely because they have no control over the market.
I completely agree with the philosophy of dignity before the record. Proof is not dignity. I'm with you. But you are assuming that orientation automatically brings comfort.
It brings clarity.
Sometimes orientation just confirms how bleak the situation is. If the market is broken, does mapping out their source layer offer anything more than academic comfort? If I am a client with massive financial pressure, knowing that my claims are perfectly mapped and my privacy boundaries are pristine doesn't pay my rent.
But it keeps you from getting sued or fired later for falsifying a record.
The steadiness you are talking about is valuable, sure, but action is what cures transition shock. When you optimize something, even something small, like tweaking a LinkedIn headline, you give them a win. You build momentum. The clinical detachment of the LPR method, separating the governed from the ungoverned, it's a luxury for people who have the time to sit back and philosophize about their career trajectory.
But that clinical detachment, as you call it, is exactly what protects the client from false hope. Let's look at the mechanics of the weak response versus the LPR-aligned response in the text.
Okay.
If a client says, the market is broken, the weak response is, stay positive, let's just make your resume pop. You just need confidence. That's the dopamine hit.
It's encouragement.
It's false encouragement if it's not backed by evidence. The LPR-aligned response is to acknowledge that parts of the system are indeed low feedback and uninterpretable. We tell them, we cannot control the ATS algorithms or the hiring manager's mood. What we can do is improve the parts of your signal we can govern.
Right, but
That isn't academic comfort. That is the only honest comfort an advisor can give. The advisor is not a therapist unless they are separately qualified as one. If we try to manage their emotions by giving them a quick surface optimization just to make them feel better, we are drifting from advising into therapy. We are engaging in panic practice.
panic practice. Oh, I'm glad you brought that up because this is where I think the rigid methodology actually contradicts itself when the rubber meets the road.
How so?
Think about the I just need a job scenario in the text. The client says, I do not care about a record. I just need a job right now.
Right, extreme urgency.
The text provides the LPR-aligned solution for this exact crisis. It says to acknowledge the urgency and focus on the, quote, smallest useful record entry first, so the work supports immediate materials. That is a massive concession.
It's not a concession.
It proves my point. In a crisis, the method bends. You collapse the rigid orient, then optimize sequence into a targeted optimization of a tiny scope just to get the immediate material out the door. You are functionally bypassing the deep diagnostic work to provide immediate surface relief.
Okay, let me stop you right there. Are you not confusing scope reduction with optimization?
I don't think I am. If you shrink the scope down to a single bullet point to meet a deadline, and you tweak that bullet point to look better for the employer, you are optimizing.
No, you are missing the fundamental mechanism of how the method operates under pressure. I would argue that choosing that smallest useful record entry fundamentally requires orientation. How do you know which small piece of evidence is safe to render?
Well, by asking them.
Yes, but you cannot know if it's safe without first mapping the claims and applying those privacy constraints to that specific piece of evidence. Shrinking the scope is a product of orientation, not a bypass of it. The text explicitly says, urgency may affect how small the first scope is. Urgency should not remove governance.
I know what you're thinking listening to this. How on earth do you achieve that governance in a 45-minute crisis session?
You stay disciplined.
Time is a zero-sum game. If you have 45 minutes with a desperate client and you spend 40 minutes doing an evidence inventory, reconstructing their context, and carefully labeling privacy constraints on a single record entry,
It doesn't take 40 minutes.
you have exactly 5 minutes left to actually render the surface they need to apply for the job. If the scope is that small, the orientation and the optimization have to happen simultaneously. You are fixing the wording while asking about the evidence. The rigid sequence of the advisor practice rhythm, orient, scope, capture, classify, map claims, apply privacy, render. That entire rhythm collapses into a single fluid motion. To pretend otherwise is to ignore the reality of human interaction in high-stress environments.
I mean, it doesn't take 40 minutes to orient on a single entry. Orientation scales. It doesn't disappear.
It can take 3 minutes if you are disciplined. 3 minutes?
Yes. You ask one targeted question. Where is the data for this specific bullet point coming from? The moment you ask to see the underlying email or the project brief, you are orienting. It only collapses into a fluid simultaneous motion if the advisor loses their discipline. And the rhythm exists specifically to prevent that kind of panic practice.
But is it panic practice if it actually works for the client?
Think about the risk. A client says, "Can I claim leadership? I need leadership on my resume for this role." The urgency is high. The application closes tonight.
Right.
If you merge orientation and optimization into one fluid motion, as you suggest, you end up doing exactly what the text warns against. You drift from rendering into invention. You just write a leadership bullet so they feel good.
No, I wouldn't invent it.
But the methodical LPR advisor stops. They orient, they ask, what kind of leadership does the evidence actually support? Is it formal supervision of direct reports? Was it project coordination? Or just informal influence? If you don't enforce the sequence, you end up with an unsupported claim. And the moment that claim is challenged in a phone screen, the client's credibility is destroyed.
Well, their credibility is destroyed. I agree we cannot drift into invention. The rule is no unsupported claims. I'm with you there.
Good. But you are applying a maximum risk framework to every interaction. Not every optimization is a high-risk lie waiting to be uncovered. Let's look at a realistic low-risk example.
Okay. Sometimes a client just has terrible phrasing for a completely valid, mature piece of evidence. They wrote, "made the spreadsheet better." What they actually did was automated the financial reporting workflow.
Sure. If they have the evidence for the latter, correcting the surface language immediately isn't invention, it's translation. And yes, you verify the evidence. You ask, did you use macros for this? But you do it while you are optimizing the sentence on the screen. The doctrine says diagnose before optimizing, but in the trenches of a job search, diagnosis and treatment are often the exact same conversation.
They may happen in the same conversation, but intellectually and methodologically, one must precede the other, even if only by seconds.
That's splitting hairs, isn't it?
It's not. If you diagnose while treating, you are letting the desired treatment dictate the diagnosis. You are letting the target market lane dictate the client's historical truth. That is a profound violation of the principle that the client owns the source layer. The advisor does not invent the story to fit the market. The advisor helps the client preserve and render their professional evidence, regardless of what the market is currently demanding.
But wait, the text itself requires an advisor to ask, is the target lane credible? That is an orientation question.
Yes, it is.
You cannot orient without looking at the market. The source layer does not exist in a vacuum. It exists to be rendered for a specific channel. If the channel demands a certain shape, if it demands specific software proficiencies or management terminology, you have to orient the source towards that shape. This is exactly where the academic purity of the LPR method bumps into the gritty reality of the labor market. You say the advisor doesn't invent the story to fit the market. Fine. But if the story doesn't fit the market at all, the client starves. That is the urgency I am talking about.
And that is exactly why the LPR method is so vital. If the story doesn't fit the market, the advisor's job is not to artificially inflate the story with AI just to make it fit.
I didn't say AI inflation.
It's not to misrepresent dates to hide a gap, either. The advisor's job is to identify proof gaps, to help the client test positioning hypotheses based on actual evidence they can go out and acquire. Yes, it is a slower process. It requires patience that a desperate client might not want to give, but it is the only process that builds a portable, defensible professional record. If we abandon that for the sake of urgency, we are just another hype machine, promising outcomes we cannot control.
Nobody is advocating for a hype machine, but we are talking about practice boundaries. And I think we have to acknowledge that strict adherence to the sequence can sometimes feel like withholding a life preserver because it hasn't been properly cataloged in the ship's manifest.
So if we step back and look at where we both stand on this, we are looking at the exact same text, but drawing very different boundaries for daily practice.
Definitely.
My position remains that advisor restraint is a core part of the service. Methodical orientation, taking the time to diagnose missing context, asking if AI is inflating the language, protecting privacy, and ensuring claim maturity. It is the only way to ensure that the rendered surface remains fully accountable to the source layer. Urgency cannot be an excuse to bypass governance.
And from my perspective, while source integrity is undeniably vital, the realities of an unforgiving labor market require the advisor to adapt. When faced with transition shock or silence fatigue, letting urgency dictate a hyper-narrow scope proves that orientation and optimization are often engaged simultaneously in practice rather than strictly sequentially. The method must bend to serve the worker, because as we both agree, human dignity comes before the record.
We do agree on that, and we certainly converge on the absolute boundaries. The advisor must never invent claims out of thin air, must never expose unsafe evidence, and must never guarantee employment outcomes. The LPR method improves source discipline. It does not control the labor market.
Right.
Where we remain in deep disagreement is how strictly the orient before optimized sequence must be enforced, mechanically in the face of desperate client urgency. I see it as a hard sequential boundary. You see it as a fluid spectrum that collapses in a crisis.
Precisely. And I think this tension touches on some of the deeper boundaries outlined in Module 9. For instance, the separation of independent services.
Oh, that's a huge one.
Yeah, a CLPRA certified advisor might also be an independent resume writer or a career coach. They have to constantly navigate which hat they're wearing. Are they doing strict LPR method work right now, or are they providing an independent service? The module is incredibly strict about brand use language.
Exactly. You cannot say you are an official LPR job placement specialist. You have to distinguish between the LPR method competence and your independent business offerings. This requires a profound level of professional self-awareness. The advisor's power comes from restraint as much as skill. Knowing when to pause, refer, or decline work is just as important as knowing how to map a claim.
It is a heavy responsibility. I mean, you are dealing with people's livelihoods, their identities, and their professional truths. When a client walks in and says, "Make my resume stronger," they are really asking you to help them survive.
They are. Module 9 makes it clear that the advisor protects the method by protecting the client's source layer first. Whether you view that protection as a rigid architectural sequence or a pragmatic, simultaneous triage, it requires immense judgment.
It does. And it leaves every advisor with a choice of how they will practice when the client is sitting in front of them, asking for help.
We will leave the listener to weigh the balance between methodical doctrine and market reality for themselves. But remember, if you just paint over a cracked foundation, eventually the house is going to settle and the truth is going to show through. Thank you for joining us.